The glass tower where Julian Vance worked hummed with a quiet, expensive ambition. From his office on the 48th floor, Julian, the CEO of Vance Innovations, could stare out at the whole sprawling city. Every lit window was a story, a world he'd conquered in some small way. His company wasn't just a name, it was his empire, a monument to his own relentless drive. He'd built it from a tiny startup into a global titan, but tonight his gaze wasn't on the glittering horizon. It was fixed on a reflection in the window. The reflection of an old man, Arthur, methodically pushing a janitor's cart down the immaculate marble hall. Julian saw him every night, a ghost in the machine of his success. Arthur's back was stooped, his motions weary, each swipe of the mop a quiet surrender to time. A wave of pity, so strong it was almost suffocating, washed over Julian. Here was a man at the end of his life, polishing the floors of a world he'd never get to touch, a world that Julian owned. Tonight, Julian decided, he'd do more than just watch. He'd step in, he'd change this man's life. It was a simple, charitable impulse, the kind of grand gesture that made a man like Julian feel not just powerful, but good. He had no idea he was about to shatter his own world. Julian waited until the last of the executives had gone home. He walked out of his office, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble. "Arthur," he said, his voice coming out softer than he'd intended. The old man stopped, startled, and turned. His eyes, clouded with age, widened a little. In all his years working here, the CEO had never spoken to him. "Mr. Vance," Arthur said, his voice raspy. He held the handle of his mop like a shield. "I see you every night," Julian said, stepping closer. "You work hard, harder than anyone in this building." Arthur managed a weak, tired smile. "A job's a job, sir. Gotta keep the lights on." That simple phrase, "gotta keep the lights on," twisted something in Julian's chest. "No," Julian said, his decision suddenly firm as steel. "You've done enough. I want to give you something." He pulled a sleek black checkbook from his coat pocket and uncapped a gold pen. The click echoed in the massive hall. "I want you to retire. I'm going to write you a check. Let's say $500,000. Enough to live out your days in comfort. No more mops. No more floors." He held the pen over the check, fully expecting tears or at least a stammered thank you. He was offering the man an explosion of joy, a whole new life. Instead, Arthur just stared. There was no joy in his eyes. There was something else, something Julian couldn't read. It looked almost like pity. "Thank you, sir," Arthur said, his voice unnervingly steady. "But I can't accept that." Julian was floored. "What? Why not? This is your chance to be free." "Some things aren't for sale, Mr. Vance," Arthur said, turning back to his cart. "But I appreciate the offer." Julian stood there, checkbook in hand, completely bewildered. The janitor had just turned down $500,000. It wasn't pride, not exactly. It wasn't humility. It was something else entirely. For the first time in a very long time, Julian Vance felt a prickle of unease, like he'd just failed a test he didn't even know he was taking. This couldn't be the end of the story. He had to understand. The next day, Julian couldn't focus. The janitor's refusal was a discordant note in his perfectly ordered life. He had his assistant run a discreet background check. Arthur Finch, 74 years old, lived in a small, run-down bungalow in a forgotten part of the city. No family, it didn't make any sense. Why would a man with nothing refuse everything? That evening, Julian drove his black sedan through neighborhoods he hadn't seen in years. He found Arthur's house, a modest, almost crumbling place, with a defiant little garden of stubborn flowers. He knocked. Arthur opened the door, visibly surprised. "Mr. Vance?" "I'm sorry to intrude," Julian said, his corporate polish feeling flimsy and out of place here. "I had to understand. Why did you refuse the money?" Arthur let out a long, weary sigh and motioned for him to come inside. The house was tiny and threadbare, but meticulously clean. The walls weren't covered with family photos, but with old framed blueprints and technical drawings. Julian's eyes locked onto one, a schematic for a revolutionary microprocessor. It looked familiar. "Tea?" Arthur asked, pointing to a worn armchair. Julian shook his head, his eyes still glued to the blueprint. "You're an engineer." I was, Arthur said quietly, putting a kettle on the stove. A long time ago. A surge of energy hit Julian. This was the missing piece. Pride. So that's it, he said, a smile returning to his face. You have your pride. I respect that. But Arthur, look around you. You deserve better than this. Let me help. He began to pace the small room, his voice filling with the same passion that had won over countless boardrooms. I know what it's like to build something from nothing, Julian began, his chest swelling. When I took over this company, it was just a shell. A good idea maybe, but no direction. I poured my soul into it, worked 80-hour weeks, slept in the office. I sacrificed everything to make Vance Innovations what it is today. I built this legacy. Every patent, every product, every floor of that building, that was all me. I know what it means to create something. That's why I want to give you this gift. From one builder to another. He'd been looking at his own reflection in the glass of a picture frame, his speech hitting its crescendo. He felt good. Righteous, even. Arthur had been silent, just listening. When Julian finally paused, Arthur's voice cut through the air clear and heavy, sucking the very breath out of the room. You didn't build it, he said softly. Julian turned. I'm sorry? Vance Innovations, Arthur clarified, his gaze unflinching. You didn't build it. You inherited it. You grew it, yes. But you didn't build it. Julian let out a short, incredulous laugh. Arthur, with all due respect, I was there. My predecessor, Robert Sterling, he mentored me, but I was the one who made this company a global power. The core innovations, the foundational tech. That was my strategy. Arthur slowly walked to the wall of blueprints and pointed to the one that looked so familiar. That's patent 4815-162, the Vance unit, the core processor that launched the entire company, the one Robert Sterling showed you when he hired you, the one he told you he designed. Yes, Julian said, his patience wearing thin. It was his genius. Arthur met Julian's eyes, and in their depths, Julian saw 30 years of buried history. No, Arthur said, his voice quiet but absolute. It was mine. The words just hung there, dense and impossible. A cold dread, a feeling Julian hadn't had since the early days when bankruptcy was a terrifyingly real possibility, began to creep up his spine. What are you talking about? He stammered, his confidence evaporating. Arthur walked over to an old locked wooden chest in the corner. He fumbled with a small key that hung around his neck, and the click of the lock sounded like a gunshot. He lifted the heavy lid. Inside, nestled in yellowed velvet, were dozens more blueprints and notebooks, volumes of them filled with frantic, brilliant equations and handwritten notes. Robert Sterling was my partner, Arthur began, his voice a low, steady current of memory. We started the company in my garage, right here in this neighborhood. It wasn't called Vance Innovations, it was Apex Dynamics. We had a dream. We were going to change the world. He pulled out a faded photograph of two young men, arms slung around each other, grinning in front of a garage door with a hand-painted sign, Apex Dynamics. One was a younger, brighter Arthur. The other was a young Robert Sterling, Julian's mentor, the man he'd revered. We were close, Arthur continued, a distant ache in his voice. He was the salesman, the face of the company. I was the engine. I designed the processor. I wrote the code. It was my life's work. He ran a trembling hand over a notebook. We needed funding to scale up. Rob found an investor and set up a new corporate structure. He told me it was just a formality to protect our intellectual property. Julian's world was tilting on its axis. He could see the rest of the story before Arthur even said the words. A classic, brutal tale of betrayal. He had me sign papers, Arthur said, his gaze far away. Complex legal documents I didn't understand. I trusted him. He was my best friend. The next week, I was locked out. The company name was changed. My patents were registered under the new entity, with Robert Sterling listed as the sole inventor. I was served with an NDA so airtight, I couldn't tell a soul what I'd created without facing financial ruin and prison. Julian's mind raced, desperate to find a flaw, a lie. But why didn't you fight? Arthur finally looked up, and the sadness in his eyes was so profound it felt like a physical weight. I had nothing. He had everything, All the best lawyers money could buy. I had a mortgage on this house and a daughter to feed. He offered me a settlement, a pittance really, just enough to go away and stay quiet. I took it because what choice did I have? Julian sank into the armchair, his legs giving out. The foundation of his life, his pride, his entire identity, was cracking apart. His legacy, the empire he thought he'd built, was a sham. It was all built on stolen genius, on the ruins of this old man's life. Robert, he told me he designed it, Julian whispered, the words sounding hollow and naive. He said he had a partner who left, who lost his nerve. Arthur let out a dry, humorless chuckle. He was always good at telling stories. Julian stared at Arthur, the stooped, weary janitor from the 48th floor. He wasn't a charity case. He was a king in exile, a ghost haunting the very palace he had built. The shock was a physical blow, leaving him breathless. His grand offer of charity now felt like a grotesque insult. An ignorant king offering a coin to the man he had unknowingly usurped. The silence in the small house was deafening, broken only by the faint whistle of the forgotten kettle. Julian felt a hollowness spread through his chest, a vacuum where his pride used to be. He looked at Arthur, truly saw him for the first time, and saw not a janitor but the architect of his world. "Why?" Julian asked, his voice cracking. It was the only word he could find. "Why are you working there? Of all the places on earth, why clean the floors of the company that was stolen from you?" Arthur walked to the stove, turned off the flame and poured the hot water into 2 chipped mugs. His hands were steady. He placed one on the table in front of Julian. "After Rob died," Arthur began calmly, "I watched you take over. I read about you in the papers. The visionary. The boy wonder. You were brilliant, I'll give you that. You took my engine and built a supercar around it. You took it to places I never even dreamed of." He took a slow sip. "At first it was just curiosity. I got the job as a night janitor through a contractor, so no one at Vance would ever connect the dots. I just wanted to see it, to walk the halls of the company I'd started and see what it had become." He paused, his gaze drifting to the blueprints. "But then it became something else, a pilgrimage, a vigil. I was watching my legacy. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about the idea. To see if the thing I created was still good. To see if it was in the right hands." Julian felt a fresh wave of nausea. He hadn't just been running a company. He'd been performing on a stage for an audience of one. Every success, every award had been silently observed by the man who deserved all the credit. "So every night," Julian said, the devastating realization hitting him, "You've been watching me." "I have," Arthur confirmed. "I watched you launch the Phoenix line, a brilliant adaptation of my original power management system. I watched you win the Innovator of the Decade award, holding a trophy that should have been mine. I swept up the confetti after your parties. I cleaned the glass on your office door, the one with your name on it, where mine should have been." There was no anger in his voice, and that was the most devastating part. It wasn't hatred or revenge that kept Arthur there. It was something far more complex and heartbreaking. It was a form of love, a father watching his child, stolen at birth, grow up from a distance. "It broke my heart," Arthur said, finally giving voice to the look Julian had seen in his eyes. "Every single night. Not because of the money or the fame. It broke my heart to see another man get the credit for my life's work. To know that my creation would never know its true father. But it was a heartbreak I chose, because leaving would have been worse. It would have meant letting go completely." Julian stared at his own hands, the hands that had signed billion-dollar deals and accepted awards. They felt like they belonged to someone else. He was a fraud. His entire life was built on a lie. He hadn't just been unknowingly complicit. He had been the proud face of the theft, polishing a stolen crown and calling it his own. He thought of his offer. $500,000. The sheer arrogance of it. He had offered this man a fraction of what he was owed and called it a gift, when in reality every dollar to his name was, in a way, Arthur's. The truth didn't just sting. It hollowed him out, leaving nothing but a profound, gut-wrenching shame. The billionaire hadn't just tried to help a janitor. He had stood on the shoulders of a giant and, in his ignorance, tried to offer him a footstool. The heartbreak wasn't Arthur's alone anymore. It was now Julian's, a cold, permanent shard of ice in his own chest. For a week, Julian didn't go to the office. Calls from the board went unanswered. He sat in his sterile penthouse, where the city view he once saw as his kingdom now felt like a monument to his own ignorance. The ambition that had driven him his entire life was gone, replaced by a crushing, silent weight. He couldn't undo the past. He couldn't give Arthur back 30 years. Robert Sterling was dead. What could he possibly do? Tell the world that Vance Innovations was built on a lie. The stock would plummet. Thousands of people would lose their jobs. The company, Arthur's creation, would crumble. He could write Arthur a check for billions, but he knew with chilling certainty that Arthur would refuse. Arthur wasn't there for money. He was there for something money couldn't buy, a connection to his creation. One evening, Julian drove back to the small bungalow. He didn't have a plan. He just knew he couldn't stay away. Arthur opened the door and simply stepped aside. Julian stood in the center of the small room, his expensive suit feeling like a costume. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, the words raw and honest. "Everything I thought I was, it's all based on your work, on your loss." Arthur was quiet for a long moment, studying the younger man's face, seeing the broken pride and genuine agony. "Oh, you're right," Arthur said finally. "You can't change what Robert did, and you can't give me back my name, not without destroying the company. And the idea, it's more important than either of us." Julian looked at him, bewildered. "Then what? I just go on, we pretend this never happened." "No," Arthur said. "You don't pretend, you remember. Every time you walk into that office, every time you approve a new project, every time you stand before the world and talk about Vance Innovations, you will remember that you're a steward, not a king. You're the guardian of someone else's dream. It wasn't a solution. It was a life sentence." Julian would continue to be the celebrated CEO, but it would all be an act. Privately, he would be a penitent, serving his term in a gilded cage, forever indebted to the silent janitor who was the true soul of the machine. His success would no longer be a source of pride, but a constant, painful reminder of the truth. Julian finally nodded, a profound and terrible understanding passing between them. He wouldn't be working for himself anymore. He'd be working for Arthur, to protect his legacy, to honor his genius in the only way he now could, by ensuring the creation thrived, even if its creator remained in the shadows.